And when Donald Trump campaigned on the he campaigned on the audacious claim that if he wasn't elected, there would be World War III. Since his election, the wars that he promised to end on day one have only worsened, and almost every day since has been filled with new stories of the chaos that he is causing in our country and in the world. Since last Sunday alone, when we had just learned of his illegal orders to send troops to California to control those protesting his illegal immigration policies, he has threatened to arrest its Democratic governor for the primary crime, in his words, of running for governor because he's done such a bad job. It was revealed that he flat out lied about having discussed this decision with the governor in advance. A U.S. senator, also a Democrat, was removed, forced to the ground, and handcuffed while attempting to ask one of Trump's cabinet members a question. Full-fledged war has erupted between Israel and Iran. And just yesterday, Trump held a North Korean-style military parade for his birthday. The largest protest in modern history occurred yesterday involving more than 5 million people, and an assassin, angry about those No King protests as well as other grievances, walked up to the homes of two Democratic lawmakers and shot them both, killing one along with her husband and seriously wounding the other and his spouse. I don't know about you, but it's starting to feel like World War III to me. Civil War is the title of a chilling 2024 film depicting a near future in which America is torn apart by seceding regions, California and Texas essentially, and a fascist president, overrunning our once peaceful streets with soldiers, guns, and violence. There's a terrifying scene in it when a group of journalists are captured by a homegrown militia threatening to kill them. "We are American," one of the journalists says, to which the militia's sadistic leader asks, "Well, what kind of American are you?" Meaning, which state are you from? A red one or a blue one? If they give the wrong answer, they will be executed on the spot. Civil War is especially difficult to watch because it's hyper-realistic and feels like a warning about an impending possibility that our democracy really will fall if we don't change our ways. Today, this possibility has become a reality. Things aren't yet as bad as depicted in Civil War, but I am not exaggerating when I say that our democracy has fallen. The U.S. is being torn apart based on political regions because of an authoritarian Republican president who is behaving as if he were king of the world. Since those in charge of our legislative branches and our partisan Supreme Court are unwilling to do their jobs by maintaining the separation of powers necessary for our government to function as it should, I am most serious when I say that our democracy has fallen. The events just this past week are proof enough that the rule of law, the freedom to publicly protest and to question our government, the right to due process, having legal status, Congress, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the oath of office, the U.S. Constitution, and for that matter, even science and truth and reality don't mean a damn thing anymore. Not if they conflict with the wishes of our unchecked dictator-in-chief. Now the only question before us is, can democracy get back up and fight another round, or is it down for the count? It is of some solace to me to believe that she will most likely stand again and do so before Trump's official term is over. If she doesn't, it will only be because he has managed to manufacture some national emergency to justify preventing the coming 2026 midterm elections, which is not out of the question, given the real possibility that our legislative and judicial branches of government will do nothing to stop him. Logically speaking, however, I think that it is more probable that his damage to our economy, the daily chaos upending our lives, and his incompetence, and his executive overreach, especially by militarizing law enforcement in our communities, will also result in his political party losing one or both legislative houses in 2026. And they have more seats to lose. This will restore some degree of separation between the three powers and hold Trump at bay until his term ends in 2028, and then hopefully we will be done with this bumbling, very unstable lunatic. That's the good news. The bad news is that until then, our fragile democracy will be on the mat, undergoing a 10 count that will last for at least another year and a half. That's the reality we're in. If she's unable to stand up again by then, it will be over. Democracy will have been permanently defeated in the United States. If she rises again, and I believe she will, I think many Americans will have learned a valuable lesson about taking her for granted, about the seriousness of U.S. elections, and about the absolute necessity of having a functioning democratic federal government. During his Inauguration Day speech in 1980, Ronald Reagan said, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." From then on, the Republican Party, which has held the White House 54% of the time, compared to 46% for Democrats, has worked to weaken, if not dismantle, the federal government and many of the programs that have bolstered middle-class working Americans for decades. During the same period, the GOP has worked to reduce the federal deficit solely by cutting taxes, while always under every Republican administration passing budgets that increase spending more than ever before in history, which is why I have long referred to them as the don't tax and spend anyway Republicans. But the point not to be missed is that since 1980, actually going back to 1968, when Nixon was elected, the GOP has controlled the White House more than not, and also controlled both the House and Senate for longer periods than Democrats have. They've also enjoyed more unified governments, where all houses were controlled. They are not the underdogs that they claim they are, and bear at least as much blame for the state of our nation as anyone else. During just the first 6 months of Trump's latest term, he has advanced the goal of destroying federal programs at an unprecedented rate by firing thousands of federal employees, defunding federal programs, violating federal laws, ignoring federal courts, and worst of all, violating human rights. All while making the federal government a more authoritarian force in our lives and in our communities, including undermining those state rights that his party claims to value so highly. If our democracy is unable to come back from this, and if a greater majority of Americans don't learn from what is happening, the end of democracy and our three-branched federal government will leave a void in how exactly we are going to be governed from now on. And I think we all know who wants to be first in line to fill that void. But again, logically speaking, given the relatively short time between now and the midterms, although it seems like a long time away, and a Supreme Court that has not always fallen in line with Trump's wishes, it is more probable that Democrats will gain control of one or maybe even both houses in 2026, then hold him at bay for the remainder of his term. I'm also hopeful that his disastrous presidency will have a lasting impact on our national psyche, preventing something like this from happening again, at least anytime soon. I'm also hopeful that in the meantime, the Democratic Party will rediscover what it is supposed to be about, standing up for the freedoms and democratic values of that this nation is supposed to be founded upon, and for the welfare of all its citizens, including working-class Americans, not only in its biggest cities, but working-class Americans in its breadbasket, in its Rust Belt, in its mining and factory towns. Those people that are feeling like the Democrats do not represent them. With this glimmer of hope in mind, what can we do now to survive Trump and make a difference? Firstly, as Stoicism has long taught us, we should focus our minds and our efforts on matters that we can control, not on those that we cannot. We do not have the power to control who occupies the White House for the next 3.5 years. We cannot force those legislators in charge of both houses to do their jobs. It's not within our power. We cannot force the Supreme Court to rule based on the Constitution, to genuinely rule based on the Constitution, rather than the shallow and self-serving principles of the political party that appointed its majority, that turned it into a partisan court. We can't do anything about these current realities, nor much about the detrimental and harmful impacts that they are having on our society and in our lives right now. Not within our power. Yet those are all the things we're worried about, the things we're obsessing about. So returning to that boxing metaphor, we cannot change the fact that our democracy has been knocked down. But we can do our best to help her get back up, return to the fight, and win. As one who is very judicious when it comes to involving myself in mass protests these days, yesterday's No Kings protest, which included more than 2,000 events across the country and millions of participants, was extremely impressive. That level of participation has to have an impact. That many upset Americans, that many upset voters, has to make politicians take them and their concerns seriously. So congratulations to its organizers, and thanks to everyone who was able to participate. During most of my life in ministry, protesting has been my primary means of expressing my dissent. But I noticed a shift occurring in them about the same time I noticed it occurring within liberal institutions in general. They've become much less peaceful because of a growing willingness among some participants to demonize their opposition, incite conflict, and destroy property. This has become so evident that even the organizers of yesterday's event instructed participants that if violence breaks out at your protest, sit down. So I'm not the only one who notices this has to be addressed. This is a good way, of course, sitting down is a good way to distinguish yourself as a peaceful and cooperative to those policing such events, hopefully. But it is also a bit contradictory to ask those who have come to stand up to be prepared to sit down. But once violence occurs, it stigmatizes the entire event and all protesters, no matter who is standing or who is sitting. California's leadership has been quick to point out that the protests there have remained overwhelmingly peaceful, despite those who have set fire and likewise to a few vehicles. But such behavior is what the media concentrates on and what others will exploit, as they have. Sadly, this is the problem with taking our grievances to the streets these days. There is always the likelihood that some will engage in violent and destructive disobedience that does not progress our cause, nor that we want to be associated with. Yet the excuse that protesters are mostly peaceful doesn't work. Not any more than when it was said about the January 6th insurrection in the nation's capital 5 years ago. So be judicious about protesting and don't allow yourself to get caught up in any of the hate and violence that even justifiable outrage sometimes leads to. Protests can help effectively shift public opinion or sentiment, especially when the protesters are the ones being unjustly treated, as happened, for example, in 1963, when television news showed the police using fire hoses and dogs to disperse civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. It was a real shift after that. But such sentiment can also quickly turn the other direction when it's the protesters who are engaging in violence, even if it's only just a few of them. Exposing oneself to violence at the hands of the authorities takes tremendous courage, a lot more than does setting fire to Tesla and Waymo vehicles, or breaking into downtown businesses, or throwing rocks, and so forth. Which leads to civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is another related approach, which occurs when participants refuse to obey unjust laws. Spokane's former city council president, Ben Stuckert, of whom I'm a great admirer, did so just this past week by attempting to block the departure of a bus containing immigrants who had been arrested and were being removed by ICE without due process, an action for which Ben himself was arrested. From Gandhi's historic march to the sea, to illegally make salt, to Henry David Thoreau's refusal to pay poll taxes in protest of slavery, to Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white man, to sitting at a lunch counter that refuses to serve blacks, to Dr. King's historic 1965 march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to Julia Butterfly Hill, living atop a 1,000-foot redwood tree for 2 years to prevent it from being cut down. By the way, Peggy and I got to meet Julia Butterfly Hill several years ago, right after she'd come down from the tree. To the ship carrying aid to Gaza just this past week, in response to the humanitarian crisis there, an action that resulted in the arrest and deportation of Greta Thunberg among 12 other activists. Civil disobedience has long been a powerful tool in creating greater public awareness, if done right, changing sympathies, and putting pressure on political leaders to finally do the right thing. These examples, however, involved courageous, disciplined, and symbolically appropriate acts of protest and disobedience. Might I also say nonviolent disobedience. History is also littered with examples of protest and disobedience, resulting in rioting, destruction, violence, and the indiscriminate killing and beatings of bystanders. This kind of disobedience and disregard for the law can only hurt a just cause. By giving those we oppose the very excuses that they need to demonize and retaliate against us in the name of law and order. We saw this just this past week in Trump's response to ICE protesters in Los Angeles, claiming that LA would be burning to the ground if not for his salvific intervention. During a speech at the newly formed, or I should say newly renamed Fort Bragg this past week, Trump also referred to the protesters, most of whom are American citizens, as animals, as a foreign enemy whom he will liberate California from. Peaceful protesting and courageous civil disobedience are good ways to help revive our democracy, but it has become increasingly difficult to know if everyone joining us is as committed to peace and courage as we are. So again, just be as judicious as you can and walk away if you feel you are not in the right place. Protest and civil disobedience. By the way, let me just diverge a minute. After the killing of George Floyd several years ago now, there was a protest downtown, like many around the country. And it was after church, Peggy and I went down, and we just so happened to arrive at a spot where the police were standing, just as they were in a line. They weren't interfering with the protesters. Most of the protesters were across the street. They were just standing there being watchful. These are ordinary beat cops. And there were several young people harassing those police officers, trying to evoke an incident. And we were not at all comfortable with the tone of what we saw happening, and left and went home. Later, as things progressed during the night, which is often the case, there were riots and breaking windows of businesses and whatnot, Nike and whatnot, some of you might remember. That's what ended up coming of that particular protest. But we walked away when we felt uncomfortable. It's not cowardice. I don't want to be associated with that behavior. That's not who I am. That's not productive. It's counterproductive. So be prepared to walk away if you feel uncomfortable. Protest and civil disobedience are meant to push legislators and politicians to change the rules. But another strategy, and I think the best one of all, is to work to change the rules ourselves. We can do that. We have avenues. I've marched miles in protest during my quarter century as a minister, but there are only a handful of accomplishments I've engaged in that have resulted in meaningful change. And those are the things I'm most proud of. Before I left Louisville, for example, I was chair of a committee to establish a restorative justice program there that has been working to reduce the school-to-prison pipeline ever since. It took a couple of years getting up and meeting in the judge's chamber at the county courthouse every Wednesday at 8 a.m. before court started, along with working to educate and get everyone on board that we could. The police, the courts, the judges, the county prosecutor, the public defender, community activists, and so forth, all became a part of this. It wasn't easy. It wasn't sexy. There wasn't any immediate gratification like, well, I've done something. It was hard work. And we didn't even know if we were going to succeed. We didn't know if anything would come of it, all that effort. And few people knew or will ever know that I had anything to do with this now long-standing institution, which is fine. I don't care. I'm so proud that it's there. That's a lasting impact that didn't require me to go downtown and march and feel good about shouting at people. Not to demean the protests, as I said. They can be valuable, especially ones like yesterday. That's very impressive. Louisville is also where I stopped performing weddings until I would be free to perform them for everyone, equally for everyone, including gay couples. I was fired from my secular job for this stance, but that also helped me raise a lot of awareness and support for my cause. And then after coming here to Spokane, I became part of a local clergy group that helped pass marriage equality in Washington State with our People of Faith Support Freedom to Marry campaign. By the way, I'm going to diverge again, tell a little story about this. So I was asked by someone on the city council, I can't remember, it must have been Ben Stuckert, because Brian wasn't on it yet. So Ben asked if I would come and participate in this group to discuss the presence of, God, why am I forgetting the politician now? It's one of those. It wasn't Matt. No, this was. Oh my God. Well, he was one of these really very conservative Republicans who was going around making a lot of noise. Hopefully, it'll come to me. But he was going to be, he was going to be this sort of big fish in Spokane. Rick Santorum, thank you. Rick Santorum. You remember Rick Santorum? So he was going to come because we were all pushing for marriage equality. We would be the first state in the country to pass marriage equality by popular vote. Everything else was passed by legislatures, and then there were resolutions to overturn it. So some of them were overturned, some of them weren't. But we would have been the first state in the country to actually pass it by popular vote. We needed at least 40% here on the east side of the state, and we only had about 25% favorability 6 months before the election. So that's where we started this campaign. So Rick Santorum was coming here to kind of keep us from building up that momentum, that support. But it was right after Mitt Romney had made his famous 47% remark. Remember that comment that 47% of voters are whatever, idiots, however he put it. And the Republicans were really cautious about letting any recording devices into their meetings. So Rick Santorum was down at the convention center. Big fish in small pond day. That was the story of the day. The news media showed up. Well, guess what? They couldn't go in because they were afraid of being recorded. Meanwhile, outside are the People of Faith Support Freedom to Marry. All these ministers and clergy out there. And that made the news. That was the news because they had to cover it, and we were the thing to cover. Here's the thing. When I was in that meeting, that initial meeting, people wanted to protest Rick Santorum coming to Spokane. And as politely as I could, I said, look, my faith is based on the inherent worth and dignity of all people. To deny a person the right to move about this country freely violates that dignity. I cannot protest the presence of a person because I will be protesting the existence of that person. What I will do is demonstrate my values. I'm willing to stand outside and demonstrate why my values are the better values to live by. And that's where this campaign came from. Everyone said, yeah, let's do that. Let's demonstrate what we're about. We're about people of faith supporting the freedom to marry. And it was very successful. As you know, within 6 months, we had turned it to 45% countywide and almost 50%, I think actually more than 50% in the city proper. So we made history as a state. through those actions. And we did so as a church. Our church was a big part of that campaign. So, the civil disobedience allows us to demonstrate our values, not criticize or protest the values of others. So I was also part of the Smart Justice Council here several years ago that made positive changes in criminal justice. Most people don't remember all those long meetings we went to, but we did, and we made some changes. Not groundbreaking, we didn't change the ground didn't shift, but we've made positive changes to how we do criminal justice in our community through that hard, quiet, unnoticed, unsexy work. I was among those, including many in our church, who worked with Spokane Alliance to get a sick and safe leave ordinance passed, a quality jobs ordinance passed, funding for the WSU Medical School. I was the one who sponsored the local initiative to stop coal and oil trains from moving here through Spokane without significant changes to safety protocols. That ordinance failed, was not passed, but the safety issues that it raised were cited by our governor's explanation for why he refused to grant a permit to permit the construction of a new coal export terminal off of Washington shores. An unexpected consequence, an unexpected benefit. I could go on. I wrote my book, The Gadfly Papers, in an effort to counter the illiberalism that was impacting our religion, and gave it away for free as an act of dissent. It caused a lot of problems for me and for our church, but it also allowed me to get my message out due to the controversy far greater than I could have ever expected. It's hard work. It's unpredictable work. We don't know what the consequences are going to be, but it can pay off dividends. And it's lasting work. It makes a difference, makes a change. By the way, this is a pretty impressive list. Sometimes I hear, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? I think, man, isn't that enough for one person? What are you done for me lately? I'm resting. I'm giving it a rest. Okay, so this is going on longer. I'm almost done. I won't chase any more rabbits. Peggy, my wife's saying thank you. Jeez. Brutal. Okay, to summarize in two run-on sentences, what I've said so far. If we want to help revive our democracy, we must firstly maintain our own emotional and mental health by focusing on what we can do rather than obsessing about what we cannot do, what we don't have power over. That's first run-on sentence. We do have the power to participate in peaceful protest, engage in courageous acts of civil disobedience, and best of all, do what we can to change the systems, rules, and laws ourselves. But the most important strategy, which I have not mentioned yet, is the power of hope. And hope is not a feeling that we either have or we don't have. It is something that we create for ourselves when we commit to action. It then becomes the very thing that motivates us to act. Erich Fromm once wrote, "Hope is a decisive element in any attempt to bring about the social change in the direction of greater aliveness, awareness, and reason." Thus, hope cannot be passive. We cannot sit around hoping that things will get better on their own. That's not really hope, that's just wishful thinking. Fromm says to hope is a state of being. It is an inner readiness, that of intense but not yet spent activeness. Hope is believing that it is up to us to do what we can to make a difference, however we choose to go about it. Hope doesn't mean we will succeed, only that we know there's a real possibility that we can succeed. If we act, it is the thing that motivates us to action. Without hope, we will remain passive victims of history, longing for a hero or for some miracle to come along and fix things for us. Our democracy has fallen, but there are many good reasons to believe that she should not be counted out just yet. These reasons are the basis of our hope, not only in her, but in ourselves and our power to make a difference. Thank you.